11 o'clock, and so we want to get this started on time, punctual as usual. And I wanted to thank all of you for attending our education discussion today. I was under the impression that we were going to have Superintendent Luna here, who is here, and we'll introduce him in a second, and Senator Thayn, but I'm pleasantly surprised that many more lawmakers came down here and dignitaries came down here, so I'd like to just go around the room and recognize each one of them and have them state their name and where they're from. So I guess we'll start right here.
I wasn't expecting this from my daughter come. I'm Representative Andrus from Lava Hot Springs. I represent District 28. My wife, Colleen.
Thank you for coming. I might have to say, my name is Chad Inman, and I want to thank all of you for coming, but as we move along the boardwalk here, I guess we'll have Representative, what's your name, sir?
I'm Representative Vanderwoude from District 22, which is Cuna and Meridian.
And then
Senator Steve Vick from Dalton Gardens, which is just north of Coeur d'Alene.
Looking around the room here, we've got Representative, which one wants to stand up? There's
Lyndon Maven from Idaho Falls.
Representative
Neil Anderson, Blackfoot.
All right, thank you so much. Then we've got another Hawaiian. Okay, we can finally see. We've got one last person that has come in. I think she's hunting down her burger right now, and that is Senator Cheryl Nuxel from Cottonwood. Yeah. She's in the room tonight as well. So make sure that when you're done, we're done here. If you have any questions for those leaders and those lawmakers, please feel free to address them accordingly. I want to again thank you all for coming, and thank you in advance for your polite comments and questions. Okay, we are here to educate ourselves on how we can better educate our children in the state of Idaho. And so I want to just thank you in advance for those kind comments and questions, and let you know that I'm not going to be in charge of this event tonight. We're going to let another board member of Tea Party Boise step in and do the pointing and conduct the meeting here beyond this. You are going to have approximately 30 seconds to address the lawmaker or the superintendent. After that, we'll cut you off. We want to make sure that we get through there and no diatribes. We just want legitimate questions, cogent questions, and we're going to go with a format of about 10 minutes presentation from Superintendent Luna, a 10-minute presentation for Senator Thayn, and then a 5-minute from Superintendent Luna, and then a 5-minute from Senator Thayn. So I hope you enjoy this. We will have it video recorded as well as put up on our YouTube channel and several other YouTube channels. So thank you very much, and we'll talk after the meeting.
I'm going to do a quick introduction. I'll probably butcher these, but if anything's wrong, fix it when you get up here, I guess. First will be a speech from Mr. Luna. Actually, we're just okay, Mr. Thayn will go first. Stephen Thayn is your third term, is that correct? In the legislature? He's been in there for a while. It's your fourth. Anyway, Steve Thayn has been very instrumental with public education. He brought forth the 6th bill. Was that passed last year? Was that correct? Year before that. Year before last. And he is from Nana, is that correct? Let's check everything. And then Mr. Luna is from Nampa. He has been the state superintendent since 2006.
You're going to have to speak up a little bit.
Okay. He's been the state superintendent since 2006. He was appointed by George Bush in 2003 to be a special advisor to the Secretary of Education. He originally was a businessman, but got trapped in the school board and they eventually became where he is now. Anyway, so we'll go ahead and turn it over first to Mr. Thayn. And then I just... I'm a little late. Okay, we'll just turn it over.
Well, I'm really glad to be here this evening, and hopefully you can hear me. Probably going 10 minutes at a time is enough, because when we speak on the floor of the Senate, we always have these mics. So this is really encouraging that you're all interested in Common Core and issues here within the state. I operate under the principles of NP squared. NP squared is motivating people to become more productive. So the first step is to identify a problem, which unfortunately too many of us sometimes get stuck there, and then we complain a lot and get frustrated. The second step, though, is to move to solutions. So that's what I like to do most of my time, is focus on solutions to all sorts of problems. That's why I don't know how long I've been in the legislature. It's not much of a... Maybe that's the problem. I don't know what the solution is.
You haven't found the solution yet.
You haven't found the solution to that, so I just ignore that. But I've been a school teacher. I was a dairy farmer, and I have 8 kids. My wife isn't here tonight because she's doing some church responsibilities, but she did wish me good luck, which is really a step up from a couple, 6 or 8 years ago. The first time I ran, I don't think she voted for him. It's true, Ken. She's come a long way. But before I get started, because I just have a few points to make, I want to thank Superintendent Luna for coming tonight. He's been very gracious for me. We sit down and talk quite a bit. He got elected the same year that I did, the first time he was elected to state superintendent. I joined the legislature. And ever since then, I've had an open door policy. I've been able to go in there and talk to him. He pretty much understands a lot of what I'm trying to do, which is empower parents and students with choices and resources. And he's been supportive of the MAT bill, which is a Master Advancement Program, the 8 and 6 program, which encourages students to take summer classes, and if they start in the 7th grade, they can actually graduate from high school with at least a year or maybe 2 years of college. So he's been very supportive along those lines. And I know it's difficult for him sometimes. He's been called lots of names, which is unfortunate. He's usually pretty calm. In fact, I've never seen him when he wasn't calm. But he has a hard position, but we don't always agree, and this is one of those issues. So let me tell you a couple of the major concerns that I have. Put this down here also. I'm not running for State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Just had to put that out there. Thanks, Chad. Yeah. So, hopefully we can change Tom Luna's mind on a couple areas, and we'll support him. So one thing I'd like to do first, though, is really get a little overview of why I don't think public education reform has worked in my lifetime. So this has been 30 or 40 years. And so if we identify what the system is like, I think it becomes very plain what's going on. The system right now is a top-down system. The funds and the choices are controlled by bureaucrats and lawmakers, and it's a top-down system. So a top-down system has some characteristics. 1, it's inflexible. 2, it has high input costs. 3, the quality of the output is questionable at times. It's not as good as you think it would be. So, and when you couple that with recognizing who's making the choices and controlling the resources, you realize that this top-down, one-size-fits-all system, which Tom Luna doesn't agree with, by the way, I mean, he's trying to change that, is resistive to change. So the governor's education task force recommendations, there's 20 of them. If you read those, many of them are very good. But the paradigm that we're working in is that we're going to give 350 to 400 million more dollars to the public education system, and then ask the public education system to become more responsive to the parents. That's not going to happen. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to funnel the money through the people to fund their choices so the system responds to their choices. And one way of doing that, and this is a bill that's going to be introduced this year, that Tom Luna is in support of, is to allocate $200 to every junior and $400 to every senior that they can use to buy or to pay for a dual credit class. Now, dual credit classes, if you don't know, are college classes that you can take in high school. Our high schools are really extensions of community colleges. And so, I shouldn't go off on this too long, but this is a real opportunity. If you follow the money, the students, because of the choice they make, direct where the money's going, which is to a college or junior college, to take a community college class taught by a teacher in the high school. And so the money ends up going to the system, but it goes to the student first. So that's what we're talking about, empowering people with students and choices. Now when we come to Common Core, and that's why you came here tonight, my concern is, I have several, but two major ones I want to talk about tonight. One has to do with the potential loss of state sovereignty and control of the education. Because we're moving from a state top-down system in our current system that we're trying to change, and then we're going up to a multi-state. Well, in our system of government, where we have checks and balances, you have procedures. Well, we have 3 different levels of government: federal, state, and local. Then we have 3 branches of government. There's checks and balances. I don't see the check and balance in Common Core. As far as, because we're moving from state determination of some of these things to multi-state. I don't see how parents have a mechanism to have input into what's being taught, how it's being taught, what the test is like. I don't even see really a mechanism for the legislature to have, I don't see the process. And what Superintendent Luna's, I'm giving you a hard time here. You get your 10 minutes too. I feel like the supporters of Common Core are asking us to trust someone that we're going to have input. Well, you as individuals don't have any input in the system now, except to vote for elected school boards. And to be very honest, most school boards are captive of the teachers' union. I mean, it's just the way it is, because that's who they work with. They don't want to make teachers upset. Oh, by the way, I was a teacher. Okay. The reason I tell you these things isn't because I'm upset with the teachers' union. I'm not upset with the Republican or Democrat Party too much. I'm just trying to tell you what's going on and what my concerns are. So my other major concern is data. I'm concerned if we ship the data for the SBAC test, that's the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium that's associated with our Common Core arrangement, that data will go out of state because there's student data that goes with it, and that we will lose control of that data. So there's 2 major issues I'd like to bring up in the first 10 minutes. So thank you very much.
It's great to be here again, and before I get started, I want to introduce a couple of folks that are here. My wife Cindy just showed up. During the legislative session, as you representatives know, and senators, this is sometimes the only opportunity we have to see our spouses is when they show up at these events. And then my mom's here. My mom Judy is here, and my mom raised 7 children, and she's a great lady. She's a tough taskmaster, but her kids have all benefited from that, and we love her dearly, and we like to spend time with her. So I'm glad she's here. And also, I thought, who's going to be really tough if my mom's here, right? So wouldn't be the first time she came to my defense. So Steve Thayn is one of the most thought-provoking and creative legislators that we have. I've enjoyed working with him for the past 6 years. I think he's been very supportive of many of the things that if not all the things that we've attempted to do to improve education. And his efforts to give high school students more and more opportunities to move at their own pace on a mastery-based type of a system. Students all across the state are benefiting from his good work, and most of the legislators I see sitting here have been very supportive of those efforts also. I was here once before, a number of months ago, and had a full 20-25 minute presentation on kind of the history of how Idaho got involved in this effort, where we're currently at today, and what it looks like going forward. I don't want to get into all those details, but let me just touch on a few points that Steve brought up that I think are important, and perhaps through question and answer we'll get into some of the more details. I think it's important for people to understand that the genesis of this effort of having standards began back in the 90s. When we realized that we had an education system, a public education system, that there was no way to measure how students were doing academically because there was no standard to measure students against. What one school was doing in 3rd grade, another school maybe was doing in 4th grade, one other school wasn't doing it at all. Parents had no way of knowing what should my child know and be able to do at the end of this grade, 3rd grade, in order to be successful in 4th grade. And so there was an effort, and the right effort, in order to bring accountability to this public education system, that we needed to have standards. And so we went through the whole process in the 1990s of developing grade level standards for many subject areas. And so we've had standards in Idaho, and we've had core standards in Idaho since the mid-90s. Math, English, just to name 2. So what you had across the country is you had 50 states and 50 different math standards and 50 different English standards. So you would have one state that would set very high math standards. They would measure their students against those high math standards, and they would report that 70% of their students were doing well in math. You'd have another state that would set very low math standards. They would measure their students against those standards, and they would report that 85% of our students are doing well in math, and the perception was the state that was reporting 85% was doing better than the state reporting 70%, but that wasn't necessarily the case. And so, because they had different measuring sticks, different standards. So it was very difficult to compare how an Idaho school was doing compared to a school elsewhere. And so, since we had state standards, and all schools in our states have used these state standards for well over a decade, you can say, well, how is a school in Boise doing compared to a school in Coeur d'Alene or a school in Idaho Falls? And you could make that measurement because they have the same standards, and therefore you could make that comparison. But you couldn't measure a school in Boise with a school in Ontario 50 miles away, but you could measure a school in Boise with a school in Coeur d'Alene that was 400 miles away, right? Because Oregon had different math standards, and Idaho had different math standards. So there was a group of state leaders, governors and state superintendents like myself, that decided to work as states to develop standards that were common in math and English, so that we could better compare how our schools were doing with schools in other states. So we could see what's working, what's not working, and learn from each other, and have a higher level of accountability for our schools and for our taxpayers. One of the things that we talked about, well then if we want to have common standards, how should we make this happen? We all agreed it had to be state-led, no federal mandate, no federal enticement, no federal involvement. Now that doesn't mean the federal government doesn't try to take credit, and that's what some politicians do. They try to take credit for things that are working and blame others for things that aren't working. So as the core standards became more and more popular, you have seen President Obama tried to talk about it when he ran for re-election, and that was a red flag. People thought, well, President Obama's talking about states working together to develop standards, and it's a good thing, then it must be a bad thing, right? So that definitely didn't help the process. But the fact is, we agreed it had to be state-led, it had to be voluntary. And that's what it was, and that's what it remains today. And the most important reason it needed to be state-led was because if you believe like I do that you follow the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution gives the federal government no role in education. Right? Matter of fact, the 10th Amendment also makes it clear that where the Constitution does not give the federal government a role or right, then that right is left to the states or the people. Right? So if there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that gives the federal government a role in education, where does it go then? Well, look at the Idaho Constitution. There's very few things the Idaho Constitution gives responsibility to the state for, but one of those is public education. It doesn't say local school districts, right? I mean, and I'm a huge supporter of local school boards. I was one of them. But the state constitution says that the state will provide for a uniform system of common free public schools. Well, if you want to have a uniform system and meet the state constitution, then the state has always set standards for our schools, and then we've turned over responsibility to local school districts to implement that and make that work. But the state has always set graduation requirements, and districts can exceed those if they want. The state has set academic standards, and districts can exceed those if they want. And so the proper role of the state for public education is to set standards for graduation and for any number of areas in our schools. And then give local districts the flexibility on how they go about meeting those standards and meeting those expectations. So that's what we have today, and that's the standards that we have today. So let's talk about some of the concerns real quick. And when I hit my 10 minutes, let me know and I'll stop. I'm not trying to. Am I there?
No.
Okay. All right. There's been concerns raised about data collection. Those are fair and legitimate concerns. What I think it's important for people to know is that there is nothing in these standards that we've adopted that require us to collect any more data than we collected in the past. And if we move away from these standards, we do not collect any less data or any more data than we have today. That doesn't mean that we don't need to be vigilant in making sure that the data we collect remains safe and secure, and that every piece of data we collect serves an educational purpose. So I'm very supportive of the legislation that is being worked up by a number of legislators currently to make it very clear that data that is collected by the state, that it remains secure. It does not move on to the federal level or any level outside of the state when we're talking about student level data without the legislative oversight and review and permission. So that's a piece of legislation that we need. I think it will help satisfy any number of concerns that people have about data protection. But again, I want to make it clear that the state has always collected many pieces of data on children. In fact, we collect less personal data than they did when I was in school. We used to collect social security numbers. We used to collect all this personal data. We don't collect that, but we do collect a number of pieces of data. And you can see that. We make that list available on our website. Take a look at that. Go down to your local school. Ask them, I want to see every piece of data you have on my child. And take a look at it and see which, if any of it doesn't serve an educational purpose, then that's where we need to make sure that we're limiting it, and then make sure that that data remains protected as it is today. The other thing is these are standards. They're not curriculum, right? They're not textbooks. They're not lesson plans. Our policies in Idaho make it clear that districts make those choices. In fact, our policy goes as far as saying is the state will create recommended lists, but that same policy says districts are not required to choose from that list. So we go about the process of doing review and recommendations, and many small districts rely on that because they don't have the staff or the resources to do those kinds of reviews. I got a feeling that's 10 minutes. Okay. So anyways, I've tried to touch on some points that I think are points that are more relevant today than they were even a few months ago when I was here visiting. But I'm happy to take your questions. I'm happy to be here. And I'm grateful that you're here. So I'm ready.
Well, I'd just like to recognize Stephanie Zimmerman here. She's the one with the baby, and she could actually do a lot better at this than I do. She knows a lot. So if you want to know something about Common Core, is Stacy or any of the others here tonight?
Stacy's not able to be here, but Mila is right over there. She's also another member of Idahoans for Local Education. So we'll answer questions if if you really have them for us.
And you can send me sprays if I'm, or Superintendent Luna too, if you need to. So there's a couple things that I'd like to touch on. I think we have 5 minutes in this segment. One is, technically speaking, Common Core is a set of standards. The Common Core as a system with the SBAC test becomes kind of a unified whole. So the test in a lot of ways drives curriculum more than the standards do. Because for some reason we think we have to teach to a test, especially if we're going to link teacher compensation to how well the kids do on a test, and it starts really making a difference. So let's talk a little bit about the test. There's a couple of things that concern me. One, the way math is being taught in many places, and I've heard this from my local community and across the nation, is that they want to teach math to deeper understanding, which, hey, I get that. You do that through story problems, but that's another issue. But on the test, they're seeing how well they're doing the process. Now, one of the things that I need to have on a test is you always give 100% credit for the right answer, regardless of the process you use. So that's a concern. I don't think that's been resolved. The other concern is called close reading. Close reading is you take a paragraph or a little snippet, that's your writing prompt, and you're supposed to write an essay only based upon the information in that essay. And the problem that I could potentially see with that is I didn't agree with most things that were ever written in public school textbooks. And I wouldn't have repeated something that I didn't agree with. So it can be used to sift out those that agree and don't disagree with political perspective. I see some real problems with some of these pieces of the test that haven't been resolved in my mind yet. I'm not saying they can't be resolved, but they haven't been yet. Let me see. Then one other issue, and that is we're setting in motion a course of action. It's much easier to question that course of action now than to get in it and say we're going to change it later. We need to have an honest discussion, and I really appreciate Stephanie and the other ladies and those that have been involved in some of the opposition to Common Core having a good discussion. I appreciate Tom Luna. We're starting to discuss the issues, and so I think we're getting to the point where we need to say, what can we do to resolve these problems? What is the mechanism that we can make changes if we don't like an excerpt from Blue Eyes, which is on the recommended reading list of whatever, call it Common Core, I guess. And if we don't like that, can we, what do we do? What do we do? Who is Common Core? What's the governing mechanism? Who do we appeal to? I don't know. So with that, maybe.
So let me address a couple of the points. And Stephanie, I took out my contacts when I went to the bathroom, so I didn't see you sitting there. I should have noticed you with a baby in your arms that it was you, because I know you just had a recent baby. But I do appreciate the work. I appreciate parents being involved in their child's education. And folks, if parents choose not to be involved in their child's education, our best efforts may not be enough. That's just a fact, right? And so we have to deal with any number of issues when children show up for our schools, and I'm convinced every child can learn, but it's so key to have involved parents, and I appreciate parents that are involved. And Stephanie and the team that she has worked with has been very involved. They have brought things to light that demanded answers and demanded explanations, and I think that's important. I'm glad that after 15 years of having standards in Idaho, people are actually interested in the standards, because we've gone through these processes numerous times when we've adopted standards and then we've changed them and we've updated them. We do this every year for one subject area or another, and everyone is looked at every 5 years. And so that's the process. And I've never had anybody talk about standards, but now people are interested in that. That's a good thing because they do have an impact on our schools. There's no doubt. So let's talk about how you change standards. In Idaho, it's the exact same process that we used to adopt the standards in the 90s, that we used to change them 2 or 3 times during the 2000 decade, and the process we used 3 years ago when we adopted these new standards. It's a decision made eventually at the state board level and eventually through rules in front of legislative committees. And if we want to change these standards, it's the exact same process. There is no entity that we have to get permission from to change our standards. We agreed to work with other states to develop and adopt standards. But once they were adopted, that work was over. The agreements we had with states to work together, that work was over, and then every state has gone about their own effort to implement them. And that's the way it is today. So just like if we were to walk away from these standards today, we would not, it wouldn't change the way we collect data. If we were to walk away from these standards today, it would be Idaho's choice. And the only thing we would have is we would no longer have standards that were comparable with other states so that we could see how our schools are doing. There's no consequences to the federal government. There's no money we would lose or gain either way. So let me talk to you about the test real quick. The test that we are moving to gives us the opportunity to move away from a simple multiple choice test. And you know what I'm talking about. Here's a question, here's 4 answers, choose one. Now, a good portion of the new test is multiple choice, but now we have the ability to have students apply this work. For example, previously, is that me? No. Okay. Previously, we had a test question would be 5/8 plus 1/8 equals, and then you give them 4 choices. Now, a question on our new test would be, Oscar orders 3 Subway sandwiches. Sam eats a half, Sally eats a third, Joe eats 3/4. How much is left for Oscar? That's a new question. No multiple choice. Figure it out. Demonstrate that you know how to use math. Now, the value of that is simple to explain. If I've heard once, I've heard 1,000 times. These kids can't even make change. Have you ever heard that? Have you ever experienced it? Yes. Let me tell you, that same child who can't make change, if you told that student what is 500 minus 347, they would stack up a problem and they would figure it out and tell you it's 153. If you told that same student, here's an item that costs $3.47, here's a $5 bill, give me change, many of them would look at you like, I don't know how to do that. Show me a math problem I can figure out. I don't know how to apply it. And so our new assessment and our new standards focus on critical thinking and problem solving, something that we've needed in our education system for far too long. And so we're working with other states to develop this assessment. There's one reason. There's an economy of scale. Now, most of us here are fiscal conservatives. The test that we currently spend in Idaho, we spend, because we have few students, we spend a lot of money for a multiple choice test. We're going to be able to spend the same amount per student and have a test that is far more expansive and far more helpful in having students demonstrate and show their work. One of the things that someone mentioned was, how does this work and what might happen going in the future? I think that there are some questions we still have to answer about the assessment. That's why we didn't just implement it immediately. Last year, we field tested it in over 120 Idaho, or I'm sorry, we pilot tested the new test in about 120 Idaho schools. This coming spring, we will field test it in all of our schools. And then a year after that is when we finally do an operational test. So this is a multi-year phase-in of this new assessment, the same thing we did with our old assessment, so we can learn and make adjustments along the way. So there's some more information, and I guess we can take questions when you're ready. But thank you.
So before we go on, I just wanted to remind everybody that we have a sign-in sheet up here. We'd love to have everybody sign in, and we also take donations. We would rather have donations of time than money, but money is still helpful because that helps us like this. So now we're going to go ahead and do the fun part, which is the question and answer. Not that wasn't fun, of course, but question and answer session. We're going to limit it to 30 seconds. I know that a lot of times intelligent questions sometimes take more than 30 seconds because you have to set up the question. So if you can't finish your question in 30 seconds, I'm not going to cut you off, but we do have the annoying beep that will start at 30 seconds to remind you to speed it up if you have to. I'm going to go ahead and call on people as you have questions, and I will try to use non-racial ways of identifying you. And
the old guy in the red.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Well, also that 1.5 minutes for the response.
Jim Thomas, Boise.
Hi, Jim.
China and the rest of the Pacific Basin seem to be doing quite well in the world economic situation and certainly labor, higher educated people, etc. Have we looked at all at the education standards of China, South Korea, Japan, etc.?
So one of the, I mentioned that when we agreed to work together to create these standards, that there was some criteria. One of them is that it had to be state-led and voluntary. The other is that they needed to be clearer and fewer and higher than what we currently have. And the third criteria was they had to be comparable with any other country in the world. And so that was the goal, and that was the expectation. So the standards that Idaho previously had, they were measured against other states in the country, and we got a C+ on our math, and I think we got a B on our English, right, compared to other states. Nationally, compared to other countries, we were considerably lower. The new standards that we've adopted, this isn't my analysis, this is analysis of experts in Idaho and outside Idaho, is that these are equal to any other country in the world. And so we've raised our math standards considerably. Our English standards, it wasn't that heavy of a lift, but we did have to raise them. But I agree with you, there's no reason to have our children held to an academic standard that is less than any other state or any other country in the world. Or we're lying to them if we give them a diploma and tell them they're ready for the world, and we've held them to a standard that was less than what any other country or state expects of their child.
I'll just short comment. In some ways, the Common Core standards are an improvement in mathematics in particular. Partially because we got away from teaching math in a logical way. We're actually going back to more of the principles that were used in the 1880s with story problems, manipulatives. When I was going through, we didn't have that many story problems in high school. However, that's kind of that's not really the question you asked. But there has been some discussion. There are other standards out there. Some are better, some are worse. So yeah.
The center here behind the camera.
I had to write this down so I could focus. You guys know me, right?
Tom, stand up.
Is that you, Tom?
Yeah.
On camera?
Hey,
Hey, Tom, how are you?
it's good to see you. I've heard you guys speak, Tom, especially numerous times, and we finally have gotten to the point where we actually disagree on something. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Are those in opposition are we to submit to a superior governing authority as subjects? If so, how is it consistent with the principles of liberty? To put it plainly, we don't want this. I don't want it. And I'm not misguided in what I know. I've done the research. I know what it is. So how does our governing authority intend to preserve the principles of freedom and liberty on one hand while subjecting us to the abuses of government on the other?
Tom, I always like it when you cut to the chase and tell us what you really think.
I'm working on it. It's my resolution.
Have Rhoda answer that.
Well, he will. He will. I think, though, that one of the things you're asking for is what are some choices we have if we don't want to send our data, if we don't like these standards, what are some of those you know, what can we do if we don't agree with what the system's doing besides pull the kids out of school? And I think that's a great question, so I just rephrased the question for Mr. Wu.
That's good. That's a good question, Tom. And Tom, I think, you know, you and I, we've had breakfast, we've had a lot of conversations, and I agree that this is one area where, and I might be one of the few people that have gone this long without coming to a point where I disagree with the point with you, Tom. Don't you?
Or ignore me either.
Yeah.
You don't do that either. That's
But
great.
let me talk about the fact that these, what we're talking about are public schools, right? And by Constitution, the state government at that level has a responsibility to fund them, to make sure they're uniform, that is a constitutional responsibility of the state. So that in and of itself, you know, implies and I guess even requires that the state will have a role, and a rather large role, in the whole structure of education if it's going to be uniform. The state is constitutionally required to make sure that it's a uniform system. How do you do that? Well, making sure that every student has equal access and opportunity is obviously part of uniform, right? Making sure that no matter where a child goes to school, they have the same opportunity to learn at the same high levels, and their schools are being held at the same level of accountability as every other school in Idaho. The only way you're going to know that is to measure, and the only way you're going to be able to measure is to have a standard to measure against, right? This has been a conservative, really Republican effort for many, many years in education. More accountability based on results. Well, folks, my background is in measurement science, and if you want to be able to measure something accurately, you have to have a standard to measure against, and I believe that's the proper role of the state when it comes to a public education system.
Thank you both for coming, very informative. My question is, if the state legislature should vote to not implement the standards, will we lose any funding at any level in the state?
A little history there. Did you hear the question? No. Okay, the question was, if we voted not to implement the standards, would we lose any funding basically from the federal government? And the state legislature a couple of years ago, through rule, adopted the standards. We haven't adopted the test. The legislature hasn't weighed in on that, unless I did that and I didn't know I did it. Occasionally happens. But right now, there's no funding associated with the standards. Where the link is we have a waiver from No Child Left Behind that's associated with standards. It doesn't necessarily have to be Common Core, but that's what we've chosen. That's what we've got our waiver under. If I misrepresented that.
No, that's pretty fair. I think it's important, and I'm glad that the point is being made that Idaho does not receive any federal funds because we adopted these standards. We didn't receive federal funds to entice us to adopt them. And if we were to walk away from them tomorrow, which the legislature has to do, these guys could go tomorrow morning and they could vote to repeal our use of these standards, we would not lose $1 federal. Now, Steve brought up a point. One of the things that I committed to you when I ran for election in 2006 is we would get out from underneath the onerous provisions of No Child Left Behind. And we've accomplished that. And with lack of action by the House or Senate at the national level, then what we sent a letter a couple years ago to the U.S. Department of Education and to our congressman and the White House, and we said either reauthorization or changing No Child Left Behind is either not a priority of yours or you have the political will to do it. But either way, Idaho is going our own direction. That started any number of states standing up and saying the same thing and working together as states. We were able to get waivers, if you will, from underneath many of the onerous provisions of No Child Left Behind. One of the provisions in that waiver is that states had to have college and career-ready standards. You could demonstrate that any way you wanted to. Many states chose to say, we've adopted the core standards. That's our demonstration that we have college and career-ready standards. Now, Idaho has been required by the federal government to have standards for over a decade. We've never had the federal government review our standards, and they haven't reviewed these. but you are required to have standards, and that's so that's part of the waiver. And so if we were to walk away from the Common Core standards, we would not lose our waiver, but we would have to adjust and say we're not using these standards anymore. We've moved to another set, but they would have to be college and career ready.
Go with the gentleman with the mustache and the coat.
The National Governor Association is a non-governmental lobbying group that is just yards away from Congress. And our governor is a member of that. The NGA, the National Governor Association, owns the copyright to Common Core. Right now they are waiving the license fee. I told you they're a lobbying group, right? There's a Senate bill already written that once all 50 states voluntarily sign up with Common Core, that Common Core will become mandatory across the country. And at that point, my concern is that the National Governors Association is going to jack up the fees, the license fees on Common Core, and hit our local school district and just suck money out of them. It's a completely corrupt-looking setup that's here. How can I assume that it's not corrupt?
That's a good question, and that's, I guess, my concern, is right now, we're not getting any money because of Common Core. But the tendency of our society right now is to move decision-making to a higher level of government. I can't ignore the trends in our country. And so I feel like as a state senator, I can't sit by under my watch without more assurances that we have control over what's going to happen in the future. And to me, joining the SBAC takes that away. I don't have that much problem with the Common Core standards. We can change them over time. I have not heard anything in the last quite a little bit that makes me feel any better that I can answer that question that, no, we're going to be fine. That's my concern. If they're going to, I don't think jacking up the license is that big an issue. It's control that's the issue. Will the federal government decide to overstep its bounds again? And when we have 50 states, almost 50 states doing the same thing, isn't it easier for them to come in and say, you're going to do this? That's my concern.
I think you have that concern over any number of areas when it comes to the federal government, right? That whether it's data, whether and it existed before we had core standards. The federal government has never tried. Like I said, we've had core standards in Idaho for 10, 15 years. The federal government's never asked to review them. They've never tried to force us to adopt somebody else's, right? You talk about the NGA. The NGA, I agree, it's an association of governors. But folks, what I found once I got elected to the state level is individually, it's very difficult for the states to stand up to the federal government. Very difficult. But collectively, you can get their attention. And I think that's the proper role of states. I think No Child Left Behind is a result of states not leading on education, and so the federal government tried to step in and fill that void. You finally have states that are leading on improving education. It's not the federal government that said our standards were too low and they need to be raised. It was states. Right? And we raised our standards without an enticement by the federal government. No Child Left Behind was a result of states not leading and the federal government attempting to fill that void. So this is a state-led effort. It has to remain a state-led effort. My commitment, and I think what you've heard from, what you'll hear from legislators, and the laws that are going to be proposed this year, I think will make it clear that we will always control our standards. Districts will always choose their own curriculum. They will always choose their own textbooks, their own lesson plans. And at any time the federal government tries to co-opt this, we're out. I think that's the proper path that we should be on.
How do you get out of that? How do you tell the federal government no?
Like I said, if we were to walk away from these standards today, there are no consequences. There's no financial.
All those in favor?
That's a fact. There's no financial consequences. There's no policy or law that we've broken by walking away from these. No, we're not telling the federal government no because they never made us say yes.
If I might voice your concerns, the state legislature in Idaho isn't like Arkansas or Oklahoma. I guess more Oklahoma. We haven't been as willing to challenge federal authority. We just haven't.
Boy.
So,
Why not?
well, why not?
New governor.
The reason I say that is because I'm worried that if we don't have the discussion, really a serious discussion today, and I'll let you know that the chairman of the Ed committees are going to have a joint meeting, and they're going to have two panels. I think I'll be on it, and I think Stephanie, you're going to be on it. One in favor and one opposed, and we're going to have kind of an ongoing debate, and the education committees are going to listen to us. So we're going to start airing these things. Your voice is being heard because there are issues that we're addressing, we're trying to address. I don't think your concerns have been met yet, but we're starting that process, and hopefully a lot of you will come to that hearing, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit more. But I'm concerned we don't have the political will in the legislature right now to back out of anything. So that's one concern.
We go with the Tea Party.
So, two-part question. Would you let us know when that meeting is? And how can we help you gain the political will to do what we all feel is necessary?
I can let you know because I know your contact number.
Okay. I'll let everybody else know.
Yeah, because actually Senator Getty, the Senate Committee Chair, just asked me for some names today, but he said he's going to do that.
Okay, perfect.
As far as political will, I really think it boils down to coming up with reasonable concerns. I don't think calling names is going to do it. Senator Getty actually said today that he's enjoying, the rhetoric being toned down and actually having discussions. I think the less we say, the better off we are. I mean, that's not exactly what I meant by that, but the less, the more logical our arguments are, I think the better they'll become. That's probably what I meant to say.
So, and let me just say, folks, I'm not trying to. Well, I'll just say it. I don't think anybody has stood up to the influence to try to control our schools more than I have, whether it's teachers' unions, whether it's outside influences, or the federal government. And the legislature is not kowtowed to the federal government when it comes to these standards. The federal government never required Idaho to adopt these standards. We voluntarily chose to. Now, if there's ever a point in the future where anything that the federal government says is a requirement for education, that's when the legislature will have to have the backbone to say no. But your legislators here that voted for these standards 3 years ago, they did not kowtow to the federal government. The federal government did not require it, and they don't require it today.
Did the legislators know they voted for it?
They did not.
No, I don't think that. I mean, that's not very fair to them. What I will tell you is, in the Senate, that we went through a hearing. There was many questions asked. Senator Fulcher said he needed more information. He asked for a 5-day postponement. So there was a lot of give and take. And then when they came back, they voted unanimously to support him. So it wasn't, just a rubber stamp. And definitely not in the Senate.
And I probably need to comment, so I was shaking my head. I was in the House at the time, and sometimes the senators are wiser than the representatives. Occasionally, not very often. Now, finally, John. But to me, it was just another set of standards that the State Board of Education were bringing. I didn't even know really what was going on. Maybe that was my fault. I don't think many of us at the time did. So on the House side, I don't remember the discussion. We did vote on them, but I don't remember.
The gentleman in the gray shirt behind the beam there.
Yeah. Mike Boyd from Boise. This question is for Superintendent Luna.
as an employer of hundreds of Idaho high school graduates, I support higher standards. I absolutely do. A concern that I have is the exemplar texts with the Common Core. I have a big concern with those texts. They include support of pedophilia and rape and incest. This gentleman referred to Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye book. They include support of ideas that I absolutely don't support in texts that are left-wing texts. I know that those aren't required, but why don't you disavow those texts and have your own set of exemplar text, or specifically say we're not going to use those texts?
So great question. The thing that got my wife and I involved in our children's education at a higher level was 30 years ago when our child brought home something, 25 years ago when our child brought home something that we thought was inappropriate. So these core standards are not the reason that there's objectionable things going on at your school or your district. And what I would encourage you to do is to find out from your local school district what decision your elected officials at that level have made. That's where curriculum is adopted, that's where textbooks are chosen, that's where periodicals, all of that stuff is decided at the local level. I have disavowed this material that's inappropriate. I don't want my kids learning it, I don't want my grandkids exposed to it, but I don't think you want the state deciding what your local school district can and can't do. So attend your school board meetings, find out what curriculum they've chosen to use, what text, what information they're using, and if it's objectionable, that's where you deal with it. And I agree with that approach.
But the perception is that Common Core supports these texts. And the general perception out there is if you support Common Core, you support these texts.
Well, and I agree that
I'm saying you should specifically tell people, we don't believe in that part of Common Core. We believe that the local school district should choose their own text and not even refer to that.
So tomorrow night I'll be in Bonneville in Idaho Falls doing this exact same thing I'm doing tonight. What you just said, we've been saying over and over and over since the controversy has been raised. I can't stop people from continuing to repeat things that they know aren't true, right? And so I go wherever I'm invited and stay as long as people have questions. But today in Idaho, and it always has been and must remain, those decisions are made at the local level. And inappropriate material is something that we always have to be on guard about. I dealt with it when my kids were in school 20 years ago. It can still happen today, and your local school board needs to be held accountable for those decisions.
Right here. Jerry Todd from Boise. But yet, how can we have a common standard if we're using different texts? And that's what I'm concerned about from the federal level. You talked about having equal opportunity at different locations, but what the federal government will do, as they've done before, is they turn that into equal end results. And I don't want, you said that each district has the ability to exceed the standard. So Idaho schools exceed the standard, but now what they're going to say is, oh, but look at this inner city school. They have all these other challenges, and we've got to make it equal. And so we need to take from here, where they're succeeding, and give to those who are not, because we need to make it equal. And so you said that the federal government will not be involved, but how can you assure? Because once they get their nose in, they always go down that same road, and they get involved, and they ruin everything.
So the federal government does not have their nose in this, and we have to make sure they never are allowed to stick their nose in this. But your first comment was about, remind me real quick.
Instead of having equal
you talked about
equal outcome.
You were concerned that standards will end up driving the texts that are used and stuff.
Well,
and
that could be their argument. No.
But look at past history. Idaho has had core standards, Idaho's core standards, for 15 years. We have 700 schools. They're not all using the same text. They're not all using the same curriculum, but they're all using the same standards. And it's the same thing now. We've raised our standards, and just like it didn't force a single curriculum on the state, it didn't force a single textbook, Those are local decisions. It will be the same today. Go to your school district today. Our schools have been using these core standards now for half a school year. Ask them, did anybody force the curriculum that you're using upon you? Were you given a limited list to choose from? Do you have to use the textbooks that you're currently using, or could you choose your own? Ask these questions yourselves. And then what I would encourage you to do is, we've posted these standards. They've been on our website for almost 3 years now. Go take a look at the individual standards. Tell me which one you think you have a problem with. I've never had anybody yet come forward and say, here's the standard that I think is leading to some form of something that I disagree with. Okay, well, you can remind us.
But it talks about first grade math standards and talks about reasoning abstraction.
Well, but see, and to be fair, what I was talking about was something that leads to inappropriate material or socialism or communism, which are some of the other arguments. There's always going to be people that debate about whether, you know, it's the right approach towards content.
And there's another issue here. Practically speaking, from the point of view of most of the people in this room, when you had children in school, or you have children in school now, being able to go to the school board and make changes, it's easier to get resurrected. It doesn't happen. I have a lady in Emmett that tried to change some things in Emmett High School for 20 years. It never happened. She finally moved away or died. I don't know. It doesn't happen. There's not a process where you as a parent can go in and have a process to even complain. So we're shut out. So the decision makers aren't threatened by Common Core because they're making decisions. But us as regular citizens, we don't see how we have any input over our child. And that's what I'm trying to share. That's my concern, is what input do I have for my child? Now, Senator Nuxel, was it you that brought me something from Arizona today? No, it was Representative Trujillo. I think we maybe should consider that parental right bill that Arizona passed in their legislature. It gave some direction to the school districts to provide procedures whereby parents can voice their concerns. I think that's what we're really saying here. Is let us voice our concerns. We have to Tom, he's very good about this. But when we go out to our local school districts, it's very, very difficult.
So, real quick, just so you know, I believe what Steve said is absolutely critical. That we have to give parents more say and more control over their what happens in their local schools. It's not going to be fixed by taking those responsibilities that we currently give the school districts and moving it up to the state, right? I think what Steve is saying is it needs to move down lower. But every one of those people are elected, and you've had some communities like up north that have done a good job of turning over school boards that they're not happy with, right? And it's not an easy process, but I believe in the electoral process in making that happen. We had, for a couple years in Idaho, parental input had to be part of teacher evaluations and superintendent's evaluations. Parents could choose individual courses, and the state would pay for them down to the individual credit. We had that for a couple years. We lost that when the referendums were defeated, right? But there was more choice involved in those laws than we've ever had in Idaho, and we lost that. And I obviously still support going back to allowing parents to choose even down to the individual course level. If your district is teaching an economics class or a government class, and you want to take that same course from a different source, you should have that ability. And we call it fractional ADA. And I think we should continue to have that discussion. But parental choices, I think, are and empowerment is absolutely critical.
Right here with the
Sean Bourget, citizen. I'm sorry. Was it me?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So I have a question along those lines. Many of us here are concerned whenever something indicates less local control, more centralized, standardized, efficiency, whatever, it gets our interest. And so 10 years from now, do you anticipate we look back and say these Common Core standards swung the pendulum of power and control back to the local level or more to a centralized and federal level? I know the federal government's not taking this over, but which direction is Common Core taking us?
You know, that's a really great question, because it depends in some, to a great extent, on the decisions we make this year. I've described it as there's 3 different kinds of Common Core out there. There's the Common Core that could become federalized. There's a Common Core that you described. You know, so there's a good Common Core, there's a bad Common Core, and it really depends upon what we create it to be. But right now, I'm not satisfied that we've created a version of this thing called Common Core that I'm comfortable with. I'm not saying we can't, but I'm not there yet.
So I think where we'll be 10 years from now, as I look at where we're at today, and that these core standards are here because Idaho chose to adopt them, right? And any standards that we have in the future have to be a decision of the state. Any curriculum that we use has to be chosen at the local level. All these things that we've currently had, that we currently have, we have to be vigilant and make sure that we keep them. But let me tell you why we went to higher standards, because I think that's important. This wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction. Using our previous standards, last year at the end of school, 90% of our students met our math standards, our reading standards, and over 80% of the students in Idaho met our math standards. That's pretty impressive. Our teachers are obviously helping students meet these standards, and they're doing it. But so we have this impressive number of students meeting our standards, and then we find out that 3 months later, that those who choose to go on and pursue education after high school, half of them have to take remedial courses when they get there. So if 90% are meeting our standards, but half of them are having to take remedial courses when they get to college, folks, our standards were too low. Right? We were lying to our children. We were lying to parents. Walk across the stage, here's a diploma, pat you on the back. We did a great job. Your child's ready to go. 3 months later, why is my child taking remedial courses? It's because our standards were too low. We had no ability to compare how our schools were doing with other schools in other states. And so we raised the standards, we raised the accountability level, and it did it as states working together. All right.
I did have a question about the SBAC test. I do have 2 kids right now currently in school, and I did approach my principal, my vice principal, my IT people, everybody at my school, and ask them about the SBAC testing items. One of the concerns I had is the bluest eyes that we've talked about a couple times here tonight, and there were also Dreaming in Cuban. There was also Allen Ginsberg's America poem. Things that I, as a parent, don't necessarily think should be on a test that I can't see. So when I asked them how they could assure me that those would not be on the SBAC test, when that is clearly the guidelines and it's in the core standards reading appendix. So they got to your office and they said, and I asked them for it in writing that they could assure that it would not be on the SBAC test. And they said, well, Tom Luna has assured us, TJ Bliss has assured us that those items will not be on the test. That's not good enough for me. That's just not good enough. I want it in writing. I want some control over that test. I can't get TJ Bliss to call me back. I have lost control. I've got one kid that I'm thinking about homeschooling next year because I can't get answers. I have lost control. You have given that control away in my hands.
So Idaho has used standardized tests for 10, 15 years.
You've said that 4 times.
Yeah, I think it's important to...
We understand we've used standards for a long time.
No, I said a test.
Correct.
I said a test, not standards, okay? And the point I want to make is that we've always used a source to help us develop that test. We don't have the resources or the expertise in Idaho to develop and administer a test, so we've always used a company called DRC, right? And so we've always had the ability to review and know what the content of the assessment will be, and we still have that ability. This is, and we'll gather more information. When we did a pilot test, we didn't see any of these objectionable things we talked about in the pilot test. We'll do a field test this coming year, right? We know what those items will be. We'll validate that they're the ones that we agreed to use, and we'll constantly. The reason I brought up what we've been doing for 10 or 15 years is because we'll use the same process we have in the past to make sure what you are concerned about doesn't happen. We made sure it didn't happen with the previous test we have that was computerized, generated, given by computer. We use the same process and safeguards to make sure that we don't have the same issues, that we don't experience any objectionable material. So what we did before worked, and we'll continue to do that with the new assessment.
And I look at it differently. The ISAT test was something purchased by Idaho. So we were the customer. The SBAC test we're participating in, but we're not the only customer. In fact, Idaho is a small state. I don't know who to trust there, and I don't. So someone told me the other day that they trust their politicians or representatives. I don't trust any politician, not even myself.
I wouldn't trust you either.
And so the SBAC designers, I don't know who they are. Now, Mr. Luna has told me that Idaho teachers have been participating in that, but I don't know what the motivation is behind it. I just can't accept it. Too much has gone on in my life to just say, yeah, things are going to turn out all right, especially in education. Education always has been used since the time of Martin Luther to indoctrinate people. Martin Luther wanted to use education to create soldiers for Christ. Well, we haven't had really too much. We had to work for a living, a long time ago. But so we've always had these concerns, and to go to a national level without knowing what it's going to be like scares me. That's just.
Boise. You said, Mr. Luna, over and over tonight that we have flexibility on the local level, that we can choose our content, we can choose what we teach our children, we have oversight, and yet the license agreement from the NGA and the CCSSO states that we have to use 100% of what Common Core is, and we can only add 15%. Well, how do you, reconcile those?
Yeah. So somebody else brought up copyright before, and I failed to address that. The standards Idaho currently has that we have that we've been using, for 10 or 15 years, are copywritten. And the reason is you don't want people to be able to profit from using them, right? That's our Idaho code is copywritten. Our rules and regulations are copywritten. Now, so there's a reason in government and in law that these types of policies and things that are developed are copywritten. So it's not unusual that our standards are copywritten. Now, when it comes to the 15%, we agreed when we developed the standards that after they were developed, that states that went through the adoption process, that at least 85% of the standards that they adopted would be the core standards. That's as far as it goes. There's nothing to stop Idaho from adding to those standards today or subtracting from them. The only consequence would be we would no longer have the ability to compare how our schools are doing with schools in other states, because we would once again be using different standards. But there's nobody that comes in and polices our standards and says, oh, you're only at 83%. No, it was an agreement that we would, the adoption that we would be at 85%. Now, last legislative session, the legislature voted to add cursive writing. Those are new standards in Idaho. They're not part of Common Core, right? But it's something that Idaho added. We didn't have to get anybody's permission, right? And so we have the same flexibility we've always had with our standards. The only consequence of having less than 85% of them is that we would no longer be able to compare our schools with schools in other states, because we'd be using different standards again.
And maybe to voice your concerns. That's technically true about the standards, but we have a test that goes with it. And I found that most educators tend to be somewhat administratively controlled by their bosses, their superintendents, their principals. And if they don't teach according to standards, what they're supposed to be teaching, they get demoted or they're afraid of losing their job. So it's the test with the standards that's the problem. Everything Superintendent Luna said about the standards I agree with, but it's the test with it. I view that as the enforcement arm. If we didn't have the test, the standards wouldn't mean anything to me, because we could change them however we wanted to. So the issue that I want to deal with is what can we do so that test isn't an enforcement arm that takes power away from us. That's what I'm trying to find out, and I'm hoping we can find that answer, because I haven't so far. However, I have heard of a couple of alternatives to the SBAC test that maybe we should pursue. And now then we could have the same standards. It wouldn't be quite the same test. But years ago in the 60s, we had the Iowa Basic Skills Test. And it wasn't mandated by anyone, but the states got away from it because they didn't like to be compared with other states. But we didn't have to go through such a rigorous testing procedure either. So I'd like to see some balance between the Iowa skills and the SBAC test.
This question actually comes from Valerie Candelaria, who could not be here tonight. But back at the beginning of November, we approached your office about our group, Idahoans for Local Education, doing a debate with you, and you turned us down. And we're asking that question again here tonight. Would you be willing to debate our group in an open forum like this?
Stephanie, I go everywhere. I'm gonna leave at noon tomorrow night, go to Bonneville, and you have to be back by 1 in the morning. So yeah, you bet. I mean, I've never avoided.
Because there was an email.
This group or it's a teachers union, whoever has questions, any group of parents, anybody. I've been to Bonneville. I've been to Bonner County. I'll go anywhere, everywhere.
Okay, because we have an email chain. It wasn't necessarily from you, but it was from somebody in your office who told us, no, you were done debating Common Core. So I was frankly a little surprised that this went on tonight, because we did approach you about this, and we would like to do it.
And we've never stopped making presentations on this. So I will tell you that some of my staff thinks that why do you do some of these things, and what have you. But hey, I'm an elected official. You're accountable to the people, and you make yourself available, and I always will, and always will.
Gentlemen, thanks for being here tonight. I've been to a number of these over the last 2 years, and in each one I hear concerns raised about data collection. And each time somebody offers up the explanation that the data being collected is essentially the same as in years past. But there is a substantial difference between where we are today and where we are in years past. We the people now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we have a federal government that is actively collecting over 5 billion pieces of data per day. They are building a database on each and every person on the face of this earth. Now, unless you're going to tell me that Idaho's data is more secure than an Iranian nuclear reactor that they cleverly hacked, you cannot tell me that the data that is being collected is not going to be shared with the federal government. When a parent or a person in this state wants their child's data removed from that system, currently what I'm hearing is they don't have that option. They can get a few pieces removed, but there's still individually specific data on that database. What do we do about that, and how do we opt out of it?
I'm not necessarily working on it, but I have been given a copy of the bill that tries to address some of those issues, but not to the depth that I don't think anybody can guarantee that data is secure. But this bill is pretty weak right now. In fact, Stephanie, I'll show it to you. But I think ultimately we have to have a more robust discussion on what data we're even allowed to be collected. And I think we're collecting too much. I'm not even sure the State Department of Education should have a lot of it. But we haven't had that discussion. We have a long ways to go on that discussion. We haven't started too much. But we do have the commitment of the Senator Getty on the Senate side to at least have the discussion. We'll see where it goes.
So my point I would make is we list on our website the 400 pieces of data that we collect. And I agree with the legislators, and that every piece of data we collect should have an educational value, right? Because if it doesn't, we shouldn't collect it. So take a look at that list. And I think that's part of the conversation we'll have in the coming weeks.
Well,
here's the list. Which part
question.
should we not, which we should, the State Department, whether it's me or any other state superintendent, should have to justify every piece of data that's collected and why. And then we have to make sure it's secure. So I have your same issues. The NSA, all of these issues about data security, couldn't agree with you more. So here's the data we've been collecting for years. Here's the exact points. Go to your local school tomorrow. Ask them, I want a list of all the data you collect on my child, right? And inform yourselves, and then let's have this discussion and make sure that we're doing everything necessary to protect them. And first, it has to have educational value, or we shouldn't gather it.
Right here.
I'm Gerald Thomas. I'm from Meridian. I teach out at CUNA. You made reference to the standards. You asked which one specifically you have a problem with. I'm one who has a problem with all of them. We started with outcome-based education in the 90s. That was the introduction of standards. Those weren't deemed good enough. They were supposedly beefed up under No Child Left Behind. The data that has been compared is SAT drops had their biggest drop in 2006 after the implementation of the ISAT standards. You just said that 90% of our college graduates are doing proficient on ISATs. They go to college, 50% of them need remedial courses. Those weren't the same statistics before standards were ever implemented. So all the data shows that the implementation of standards since the 90s have done nothing but damage student performance. Why do we think that implementation of these standards is going to be any different than the failure of outcome-based education and the current Idaho standards?
This is an outcome-based education, but I we'll just disagree. We'll just disagree. We have seen a significant increase in student achievement since we implemented the standards.
Where?
In reading, in math.
SAT scores are at the lowest point they've been in 30 years. Their biggest drop came in 2006. That's significant because that is the first graduating class that was educated entirely under Idaho standards.
I don't know where you get your data from, right? But
SAT and the College Board, and looking at time.
So I'm just telling you that our scores in Idaho, right, have increased steadily, which tells me that our schools are doing better. But what I've always argued is they're not improving fast enough, and our standards were too low. So we just have to disagree on the results. Folks, if you don't want standards, then we don't measure. And if you don't want to measure, then here's $1.5 billion of state money every year. We'll push it out to the schools, and we'll just see what happens. That's what we had before. And it worked. It was the conservative Republicans that said, we're not going to just keep spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on an education system without accountability. We finally have accountability. It's at a higher level.
The biggest predictor of college success is a student's GPA. That's been proven by study after study, not SAT scores.
No, we have plenty of students that are 3 and 4 points.
You're wrong. The studies are there. Paul Tuff compiled them in his book of How Children Succeed. A child's GPA, it doesn't matter if you're talking about rural Iowa or San Francisco, a child's GPA is the best predictor of post-high school success, not SAT scores.
I don't want to get into a real give and take, but let me tell you a phone call I got the other day from a parent. Her child raised their English grade, a course English grade, from a B to an A because they brought more canned food to the food cart. Right? That's her GPA. And that is not an indication of how well that child is doing academically because she brought more canned food.
So you're using an outlier.
No,
the stats are there.
Well, I'd like to interject here a little bit. It looks like it's about time to go home. I got up pretty early.
You're just getting hot.
Yeah.
I'll stay as long as I have questions.
But you know,
Fans on a little
you're talking
Everyone gets some dinner.
Do we need to turn the fans on a little bit?
You know, the question of having standards or having some measurable outcomes is really an interesting question. Should we have standards and measure it by tests, or should we be measuring it some other way? Let me give you an example of a high school in Idaho that's doing something interesting. They're doing it in this environment of standards and things. But this is New Plymouth High School. They have these truck stop down there, and they pay for dual credit classes for those students. So 3 years ago, they had a goal to have 60% of their kids graduate with at least 30 college credits. So that's a year of college before they leave high school. And they're about halfway there, 6 years into, 3 years into their 6-year plan. And what's happening is the going on rate from the kids from New Plymouth, and New Plymouth is in Pat County, which is a fairly poor county. The retention rate at college, if Idaho had as high of going on rate and retention rate as New Plymouth High School, Idaho would be the #1 state in the nation in education. So maybe we're trying to measure the wrong things. Maybe we should take the lid off. Maybe we shouldn't go down this road of standards. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should be measuring something else, like the number of college credits kids graduate with. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but
So with our 5-star rating system, we do look at how many college credit students are in high school. We look at growth academically. We look at student cheating. We do look at multiple measures. But there's plenty of research that shows that students earn 12 or more college credits while they're in high school. The vast majority of them are far more successful, and that's because folks, they're taking college level courses in high school. That means that they're meeting a higher standard before they leave. They're ready when they go on. Now, and so there is value in standards. If you don't want accountability, then you don't have standards, right? I mean that's what you lose without standards and some way to measure how students are doing academically.
We're going to do 2 more questions, and then go ahead and just say whoever wants to stay, continue discussing, you're asking questions, go ahead and do that. Well, I have a kind of a mental list of people, so I'm going to go with this guy here in the orange hat with the glasses.
Bob Mayer from Boise, and Cami, I agree with the gentleman here and with what Senator Thayn just said about maybe we should be looking at other standards. I guess I have a 2-part question. If Idaho and federal standards have been so great, according to what he said, in the last 30 years, then why are we in the situation that we're in? And the second one is, has the state of Idaho looked at being a leader in terms of perhaps checking out what Germany is doing in their 3-tiered tracking system? And that seems to work for them and channels people into the areas where the economy needs them.
So I've never been a fan of channeling children, right? I can only imagine where I would have ended up if somebody would have decided when I was in high school what they thought I was capable of.
Works for Germany.
Well, I'm just telling you, I'm not interested in somebody deciding for my children what they can and can't do as adults. I mean, if we agree on anything, folks, it's self-determination, it's freedom, right, and the ability to choose and to rise above, not somebody else's expectation or somebody else's standard for you. And so I couldn't sign on to that, and wouldn't sign on to something like that.
Are you familiar with it?
I'm sorry?
Are you familiar with it?
I'm very familiar with it. Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I mean, but there are things to learn from other countries, and one thing is they all have higher standards than we have. Every one of them had higher standards than we have, right? Okay, that's an exaggeration. Obviously, not everyone. But when you look at the Asian countries, when you look at Germany, when you look at Finland, when you look at Switzerland, when you look at Vietnam, I mean, some of these countries that not too long ago, like Czechoslovakia and the Ukraine, that were behind the Iron Curtain, that are now outperforming our schools and our children. It's not because our schools aren't improving every year. It's they're improving faster. and they hold their children to a higher standard. And you know what? Their students rise to that level. I'm confident Idaho's kids can do just the same. So we do try to learn from others, but not everything, I think, is worth duplicating that we see in other foreign countries.
Citizens last stand, sorry, I forget.
I guess the frustration you're hearing here, Superintendent, is the fact that you could go back 100 years and we graduated a smarter, better 8th grader that were the ones that took us to the moon. We built the foundation, took us to the moon by the 70s. And almost half of the people that worked in that program, or 40% of the people who worked in the space program, were 8th grade graduates. You have to stop and think about that for a minute. 15% of them were college graduates, the rest of them were high school graduates. They took us to the moon. If you look at the performance that we have now, that we're near the bottom in almost every category, I think the frustration you're hearing here is how can you continue to say the standards work in the face of the actual evidence? Especially any federal standard.
So you're asking me to defend a system that I have worked my whole time in to change and improve, right? And so I won't. And I believe that I've always been a supporter of standards, because I don't know how you ever determine if something is efficient and working or not without standards. You couldn't run a company without standards. You couldn't balance a checkbook without standards. I'll tell you one standard we do have in America that is constant, and that's the dollar bill. And how are Idaho schools compared? How much money do you spend per child? That's the only standard that Idaho schools are compared with across the country. Time after time after time, we all use the same currency, so that's the standard. And what do you hear? Idaho doesn't spend as much, so they must not be doing as well. Folks, we have to have a different standard. It can't be just based on how much money you spend. It has to be on how your students are doing academically. And if you want to move away from this argument about how much money you spend, then you want to be able to compare. So we have to have more than just currency as a standard on how your schools are doing academically.
Well, using the academic as well as the we're at the bottom of the list as far as wages go. That means we're not as productive. It goes back to Senator Thayn's point on ND squared, right? Until we become a well-created society again, we can't. And the only way to do that is to turn out students that can critically think and do the things that they could do 100 years ago when there were no standards, but we turned out a better student. And by the 8th grade, which has been comparable now to a second-year college student, that 8th grade. So we turned out 100 years better educated. So how do we go 100 years and get here? That's the question.
So you have to hold the system accountable for results. You have to.
So we're going to go ahead and officially, technically end this.
I want to say one last question. I want to thank everyone for coming again, and I think that we can probably get, I'm assuming, Superintendent of Education back here maybe in a couple of months. Sure. Towards the end of the session. It's really, at the end of the session is when they start talking about money inside of the budget. So that might be even a more important time to have everybody back here. Might have to get a different venue. But we want to thank everyone for coming. And Superintendent of Education said he'd stick around a few minutes. Maybe Senator Thayn would stick around a few minutes if you want to have a crucial one-on-one. And I want to thank you guys for coming. It's been great.
Susie Alford organizes meetings.